The silence in Maya's office was a particular kind, thick, velvety, a palpable entity woven from the soft rustle of a single page, turned with archival care in a 16th century folio. The faint, sweet decay scent of old leather bindings and the lavender from hand-stitched sachets placed between sheets of acid-free tissue and the perpetual low hum of the climate control system that maintained a perpetual 72 degrees and 55% humidity. A perfect stasis for the past. Maya's own breathing, always measured, felt like the only animate sound in this temple of preserved thought. Her world was one of faithful, meticulous translation, a vocation of shadows and echoes. She did not write history. She provided the discreet subtitles for its whispering ghosts. Her current task was a bundle of mercantile letters from a Venetian doge's agent, their ink faded to the color of dried blood, their concerns eternally mundane. The price of saffron, the reliability of a sea captain, a debt owed. She found a grim comfort in their concrete worries. They required no interpretation of the soul, only a fluent mind. This world, with its clear rules and respectful distance from its subjects, perfectly mirrored her life with David, a man who navigated the most intimate terrains of the human body with the same dispassionate excellence. As a leading cardiac surgeon, David's love was as precise, reliable, and clean as his geometric incisions. Their life together, now spanning 8 years, was a widely admired masterpiece of quiet synergy. Their mornings began with a shared pot of single-origin coffee in the Financial Times. Their evenings often concluded with mutually exhausted silence over a healthy prepared meal. Their conversations a respectful exchange of the day's professional puzzles. They were partners in the most adult sense, a joint venture of stability, taste, and ambition. He was by every rational metric a good man, her steadfast anchor in a world she often found bewilderingly loud. So why, on this unremarkable Tuesday, did the sight of his monogrammed cufflinks, laid with geometric precision on his dresser the night before, suddenly strike her as the components of a very subtle, very elegant lock? The fissure in this impeccably ordered world did not appear with a dramatic crack, but with a slow, insidious seep, like damp threatening the foundation of a great library. It arrived in the form of a whispered scholarly crisis, relayed via a late-night email from her former mentor, Professor Alistair Finch, a man whose own reputation was built on deciphering the indecipherable. The subject line was stark: urgent consult, the Velasco manuscripts, discretion paramount. The body of the message was a masterpiece of academic intrigue. A private collector of staggering wealth and pathological reclusiveness, one Javier Velasco, had come into possession of what was possibly the literary find of the decade. A cache of personal letters, fragmented journals, and blasphemous poetic drafts attributed to one Luis de la Cruz, a minor, mystically inclined Baroque poet who had vanished from historical record under a cloud of heresy whispers. The materials were not just textually complex, a turbulent soup of Latin, archaic Spanish, Portuguese, and a private symbol-laden patois, but they were also in a state of rapid, alarming physical decay. Velasco demanded not a remote translator, but a live-in textual archaeologist, a sensibility who would commit to a full month's residence in the isolated silence of his Andalusian finca to work directly with the originals under controlled conditions. The compensation was a figure that made Maya's breath catch. The confidentiality clause was draconian. "The material is volatile, Maya," Finch wrote, "not just chemically, emotionally, psychically. It is a poison and an antidote in one. It requires a translator who understands that some words are not meant to be read, but heard in the bones. I thought of you because you have never confused accuracy with truth." David's reaction, when she presented it as a hypothetical professional opportunity over poached salmon that evening, was characteristically pragmatic, a cost-benefit analysis conducted between bites. "A month is a significant temporal investment," he said, his knife making no sound on the porcelain. "And the location is remote, but the Finch connection is impeccable, and the financial and professional capital is substantial. It could effectively endow your own research for years to come." He reached across the table, his hand always so warm and steady covering hers. "Your work is important. If this is the step, you should take it. I'll manage here. Just ensure the estate has adequate security protocols and reliable communication. I'll miss your presence, of course. His trust was a vault of reinforced steel, its mechanisms smooth and silent, and in all their years together, she had never once given him cause to question its integrity. His concern was for her safety, her comfort, the parameters of the project. The thought that the project's true danger might not be poor internet or a dodgy lock, but the contents of the crumbling pages themselves, did not seem to occur to him. It barely occurred to her. The journey to La Cuesta del Silencio, the Hill of Silence, felt less like travel and more like a deliberate shedding of epochs. The high-speed train from Madrid gave way to a slower regional line, which surrendered to a bus that wound through sun-bleached towns where old men watched its passage from shadowed doorways. The final leg was a taxi, a battered Mercedes that climbed a ribbon of asphalt so narrow and twisted it seemed to defy the very logic of the hills. With each mile, the air grew thinner, hotter, more heavily scented with crushed rosemary, hot pine resin, and the dry ancient breath of the earth itself. The noise of the world, the electronic hum, the urban chatter was filtered out until only the primordial silence remained, a silence so profound it had weight and texture. The estate, when it finally revealed itself, was not a picturesque Andalusian villa. It was a fortress of ochre stone and severe lines, built not for charm, but for endurance, perched on a bony ridge like a raptor's nest. It commanded a terrifying vista, a vast rolling sea of silver-green olive groves that flowed to the horizon, where distant mountains shimmered in a heat haze. The taxi departed, leaving her alone with her suitcase in a courtyard of swept dirt, the only sound the frantic chirping of cicadas and the slow, mournful coo of a dove, hidden somewhere in the deep shade of a cypress tree. Javier Velasco emerged from the shadow of a massive, iron-studded door. He was not the frail, parchment-skinned octogenarian her imagination, influenced by Finch's warnings, had conjured. He was a man perhaps in his late 50s, but shaped by elements that had nothing to do with calendar years. Tall and lean, he had the tensile, weathered grace of an ancient olive tree that had withstood a millennium of winds. His hair was a thick, unruly mane of black, streaked with fierce, iron gray, tied carelessly at his nape. His face was all sharp planes and angles, a landscape of disciplined austerity, and his skin was the color and texture of the earth itself, tanned and lined by a lifetime of sun. But it was his eyes that arrested her. They were the color of the Tierra Negra, the dark, rain-starved soil of the region. So deep and opaque, they seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He wore simple, dark linen trousers and a white cotton shirt, open at the throat. The sleeves rolled precisely to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with sinew and a tracery of old, thin, white scars, the signature of a life engaged with tangible things. He did not smile, nor did he offer a hand in greeting. "Senora Grant," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to emanate from the stones under their feet, his English flawless but shaped by a Castilian cadence. "You are punctual. The documents await you in the scriptorium. You will follow the protocols. No removals, no unauthorized reproduction. You work with the light nature provides. You respect the silence the papers require. Is this understood?" It was less a question than a statement of law. Maya, her professional armor firmly in place, gave a curt nod. "Perfectly, Senor Velasco." The scriptorium was a long, barrel-vaulted room that ran the length of the east wing, its walls 3 feet thick, keeping the searing afternoon heat at bay like a fortress. One entire wall was a series of arched windows, unadorned by curtains, framing the breathtaking, almost punitive expanse of the valley below. In the center of the room, bathed in the clear, northern light, sat a massive table of ancient, blackened oak, and upon it, resting on cushions of specially formulated gray, archival foam, lay the Velasco manuscripts. Her first sight of them stole the air from her lungs. This was not the neat, if faded correspondence of Venetian merchants. This was chaos captured on the verge of dissolution. The papers were a heartbreaking palette of decay, Foxing blooms spread like archipelagos of rust across pages. The edges were brittle and crumbling as old autumn leaves, and the ink varied from a ghostly water-stained sepia to a startling, defiant jet black that seemed to have bitten into the very fiber of the paper. The handwriting of Luis de la Cruz was an agitated, theatrical scrawl, a physical manifestation of a mind in torment. Words were slashed out with furious strokes. Margins were filled with cramped, spiraling annotations, strange alchemical symbols, and tiny, disturbingly precise drawings of eyes, hearts pierced by thorns, and winged serpents. The text itself switched languages mid-sentence, from the liturgical Latin of the Mass to the gutter Spanish of the Seville streets, to a fluid, poetic Portuguese, as if the poet's mind refused to be confined by any one tongue. It spoke of visions of a weeping Christ, of the erotic embrace of divine light, of a despair so profound it was described as the taste of cold iron on the soul's tongue. Her initial days were an exercise in professional frustration, bordering on despair. Javier was a near constant presence, a silent, watchful statue in a worn leather armchair in the corner of the room. He would often sit for hours, not reading, not sleeping, but simply gazing out at the olive groves, his profile stark against the light, as if listening to a complex, hidden music in the wind. He intervened rarely, but when he did, it was with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had not just studied these papers, but had absorbed them through his skin. On the third day, she was struggling with a particularly dense passage where de la Cruz described a mystical experience using the phrase, el fuego oscuro del alma. She had rendered it with confident accuracy, the dark fire of the soul. A voice like stone grinding on stone came from the corner. "That is incorrect," she started, her pen skidding. "I beg your pardon. The translation is lexically sound. Fuego is fire. Oscuro is dark. Alma is soul." Javier rose from his chair and crossed the room with a predator's silent grace. He did not look at her, but at the page, his dark eyes scanning the frantic script. "It is accurate," he conceded, the word sounding like a minor insult. "And it is dead. You have taken a living nerve and described it as a piece of string." He finally turned those soil-dark eyes on her. The intensity in them was unnerving. For de la Cruz, this fire was not a metaphor. It was a physiological fact. It was a burning in the marrow that produced no light, only smoke that choked his prayers. It was the heat of a forge where the self was being destroyed to be remade, and he was terrified of both the destruction and the creation. Your words carry definition. They do not carry the weight. Maya felt a hot flush of defensive anger rise in her cheeks. She was a respected professional, not a student to be chastised. "My job is to translate meaning, Senor Velasco, not to perform a psychic autopsy." A faint, grim smile touched his lips, the first she had seen. It did not reach his eyes. "Then you have taken the wrong job, Senora Grant. The meaning is the autopsy, and the subject is not just the poet. It is you." He left her then, returning to his silent vigil. But his words festered in the quiet of the room. Slowly, reluctantly, like a door warped shut by humidity being forced open, she began to adjust her method. She spent an entire morning not translating a single line, but simply staring at a page where the poet had written the same phrase, Dios mío, over and over, each iteration more chaotic than the last, until the words dissolved into an abstract, inky scream. She felt it then, not with her mind, but in the pit of her stomach, a wave of claustrophobic panic, a soul pounding against the walls of its own beliefs. She began to ask different questions. When Javier emerged from his stillness to bring her a cup of bitter, black coffee or a glass of cool water, she no longer asked for lexical clarifications. Instead, she heard herself say, "What was he running from in this stanza?" Or, "The space between these two lines about love and punishment, it feels like a held breath. What is he not saying?" To her astonishment, he began to answer, not with scholarly citations, but with a profound, empathetic imagination that felt like a form of time travel. He spoke of de la Cruz's exile from the Seville court not as a historical footnote, but as a perpetual winter in the bones, a cold that no earthly sun could ever thaw. He described the poet's faith as a rosa con espinas de acero, a rose with thorns of steel, a thing of terrifying beauty that drew blood with every attempt to grasp it. He did not just analyze the text, he seemed to channel its emotional weather, its barometric pressure of despair and ecstasy. Under the relentless beam of his perception, Maya's own meticulously constructed carapace, the professional detachment, the emotional restraint she wore as naturally as her own skin, began to feel like a suffocating costume. In the profound isolation of the finca, with only this intense, incomprehensible man and the ghost of a mad poet for company, the carefully curated narrative of her own life began to unravel. One evening, as a violent Levante wind howled around the stone walls, trying to find a way in, she found herself speaking not of subjunctive clauses, but of the quiet containment of her existence with David. She spoke of the pressure to be the flawless, supportive partner, the unspoken rule that her own passions were to be quiet, respectable hobbies, never storms that might disrupt the serene surface of their shared life. She confessed, her voice barely a whisper against the wind's scream, that she sometimes felt like one of her own preserved documents, valuable, intact, but fundamentally, irrevocably lifeless. Javier listened, his gaze fixed on the storm-lashed window. When she finished, the silence stretched, filled only by the wind's lament. Then he said, "You are an exquisite scribe, Maya. Your hand is steady. Your eye for detail is unparalleled. You copy the meaning with the fidelity of a devoted nun illuminating a psalm. But where?" He turned to her, his eyes black in the dim light. "Where are your own furious margins? Where are your annotations, your heresies, your spilled ink? A life lived as a perfect translation is a life borrowed. Where is your original text?" The question was a seismic event in the silent geology of her soul. It was the most intimate thing anyone had ever said to her, and it came from a virtual stranger who seemed to see the blueprint of her loneliness etched on her very bones. It was as if he had gently lifted the lid of a sarcophagus she hadn't known she was lying in, and let in a sliver of blinding, terrifying light. The first physical contact was not romantic, nor was it crude. It was an extension of his methodology, a lesson that bypassed the intellect entirely. They were grappling with the poet's central paradoxical concept, el abrazo vacío, the empty embrace. Javier found her translation, the hollow embrace, technically sufficient and emotionally sterile. "It is not about hollowness," he said, a rare flash of frustration in his voice. He paced before the great window, a panther in a cage of light and stone. "It is not an absence. It is a presence shaped by absence. It is the exact physical memory of arms, so vivid and precise that the body contorts itself around the ghost of their pressure." He stopped abruptly and strode to her. Without a word, he took her wrist. His grip was not gentle, but it was not cruel. It was definitive, like the closing of a truth. His skin was warm, rough with calluses. He led her, unresisting in her surprise, to the cold, whitewashed wall of the scriptorium. He placed her hand flat against the plaster, her fingers splayed. "Feel this wall. It is solid. It is cold. Yes?" She nodded, bewildered. "Now," he said, his voice dropping to that gravelly murmur close to her ear. He covered her hand completely with his own, pressing it more firmly against the unyielding surface. "Close your eyes. Do not feel the wall. Feel the space where the wall is not. Feel the shape of the emptiness it pushes against, that ache, that specific yearning cold. That is el abrazo vacío. It is not the plaster. It is the ghost of what the plaster excludes." She obeyed. She closed her eyes, and beneath the pressure of his hand, through the cold solidity of the wall, she felt it, a profound, resonant hollow, a void that had texture and temperature. It was the shape of everything she had ever wanted and dared not name. A sob, choked and entirely unexpected, rose in her throat. She did not pull her hand away. He held it there for a long moment, his breath stirring the hair at her temple, before slowly releasing her. The imprint of his hand seemed to remain, a brand of understanding. They did not speak of it again. They did not need to. After that, the work transformed into a dangerous, intimate dialectic. The professional barrier dissolved, replaced by a current of raw, unmetered understanding. The lies she spun for David during their brief, scheduled satellite phone calls were simple, woven from strands of truth, the material's unprecedented complexity, the need for deep, uninterrupted focus, the capriciousness of the rural internet connection. David's responses, crackling through the void, were full of practical, loving concern. Are you eating properly? Is the security adequate? I miss your voice. His trust was the pristine, generous parchment upon which she had begun, with invisible, traitorous ink, to scribe a completely different story. With Javier, Maya felt herself being reassembled from the fragments of a woman she had forgotten. He woke her in the absolute blackness before dawn to witness the luz del sueño, the dreamlight, that ephemeral hour where the world was stripped of certainty. Color bled from the landscape, leaving only shapes of profound potential. He taught her to taste the difference between olive oil pressed from pickled trees, bitter, peppery, and hoji blanca, softer, vaguely floral, and how each taste spoke of the specific patch of earth that bore it. He showed her how to smell the approach of the poniente, the west wind, which carried the damp salt of the distant Atlantic, versus the dry, scorching breath of the levante from the African coast. They argued ferociously, passionately, about the nature of love, whether it was a divine surgery or a beautiful infection, about the silence of God, about whether true art was an act of creation or an act of desperate salvage. He was a man of immense, weathered patience and sudden volcanic passion. He lived not for comfort, but for essence. His wealth was in the depth of the silence he could bear, the clarity of his perception, the stubborn, deep roots he had sunk into this hard land. He was the untranslated, chaotic, screaming original text to David's perfectly edited, critically acclaimed final edition. The physical culmination of their charged, wordless dialogue felt less like a transgression and more like a grammatical inevitability, the only possible punctuation to a sentence that had been spiraling towards its conclusion since the moment they met. It happened not in a moment of stormy passion, but in a profound, exhausted quiet. They had worked late, chasing the meaning of a single, perfect couplet that had eluded them for days. When the solution finally came, a joint, silent realization that passed between them in a glance, the release of tension was immense. The deep night had settled in, the only light a single oil lamp that painted their faces in Rembrandt shadows. They were in his private quarters, a Spartan cell of a room adjoining the scriptorium. Its only luxuries a narrow bed, a wall of books, and a small, ancient icon of a severe, dark-eyed saint. The air was cool and carried the faint, clean scent of the sage that grew in wild bursts along the hillside paths. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and in that look was all the understanding of her silent life, all the permission for sound. When he finally crossed the space between them and his mouth found hers, it was not a question nor an exploration. It was a declaration in a language older than Spanish or Latin. It tasted of the dark, tannic local wine, of wood smoke from the hearth, of the dust of old papers, and of a truth so absolute and unveiling, it felt like both a creation and an annihilation. For the first time in her adult life, Maya did not feel like a careful translator of experience. She was the experience. She was the original, screaming text. And in his arms, she was finally perfectly legible. The prescribed month dissolved, losing its boundaries, becoming a single, endless, breathless sentence, punctuated only by the sun's arc in the shared rhythm of their work and their bodies. The real world, David's world, became a faint, dissonant melody heard through thick water. During a brief, agonizingly necessary return to London to ostensibly collect specialist reference materials, a trip that felt like a cruel parody of her old life. She was a phantom in her own home. She listened to David detail with quiet excitement a groundbreaking, minimally invasive robotic valve repair procedure he was pioneering. She watched his elegant hands gesture with precise passion as he described the mechanics, the software, the improved patient outcomes. Her mind, however, was filled with the contrasting image of Javier's hands broad, stained with earth and ink, capable of terrifying gentleness as they handled crumbling paper or her own skin. She smiled at David, nodded at the appropriate moments, and felt her soul tear cleanly along a seam she now realized had been a fault line all along. The crisis, when it finally detonated the fragile piece of her double life, was born from David's own exemplary nature, his meticulous, caring thoroughness. As the person who handled the practicalities of their shared life finances, investments, travel, he was reviewing the household accounts. A notification from her corporate credit card, used for professional expenses, flagged an anomaly for his review. It was a receipt from a car rental agency in Granada, not Malaga, the nearest major airport she had flown into. The date was for a Friday during her third week at the Finca. The mileage logged on the subsequent Monday, when the car was returned, was not consistent with a quiet weekend of study at a remote estate. It suggested a circular drive of several hundred kilometers. With the detached curiosity of a diagnostician presented with an anomalous symptom, David opened her digital itinerary folder. There, among scanned passports and flight confirmations, he found a downloaded PDF article she had saved months before her departure. A travel piece from a high-end literary magazine highlighting a remote, spectacularly beautiful monastery-turned-hermitage in the Alpujarras Mountains, a place famed for its silence and its connection to Spain's mystical traditions. The name of the monastery was circled. The mileage from the Finca to that monastery and back matched the car rental receipt exactly. He did not confront her immediately. He was a man who believed in evidence, in confirmation, and in understanding the full pathology before attempting a cure. He waited with a patience that was its own form of torture until her project was complete, until she had returned home for good, bearing the finished translation like a trophy that had turned to ash in her hands. He welcomed her back with his usual quiet warmth, but his eyes, those keen, observant eyes that could follow a suture finer than a hair, now held a new, watchful quality. He bided his time for 3 days, allowing the strange, strained atmosphere between them, her guilt a thick, sickly perfume she was sure he must smell to settle. On the evening of the 4th day, he prepared one of her favorite meals, opened a bottle of expensive Burgundy, and waited until they were seated in the soft glow of their dining room's pendant light. The scene was one of domestic perfection. Then, with the calm of a surgeon making the initial, defining incision, he spoke. "The monastery of Santa Ana de la Luz," he said, sipping his wine. "Was it as profound as the article promised?" The world did not so much tilt as evaporate. The fork slipped from her numb fingers, clattering loudly on the plate. The sound was a gunshot in the silent room. All the oxygen seemed to be sucked into a vortex centered on David's composed, waiting face. She stared at him. The lie, the frantic, fabricated story about a sudden scholarly lead, a rumored secondary manuscript dying in her throat, stillborn under the terrible, knowing weight of his gaze. The car, she stammered, the words ash. "You saw the receipt." "And the mileage," he confirmed, his voice still terrifyingly even. "A specific distance, a weekend's pilgrimage, a rather romantic one for a solitary researcher." He set his glass down with infinite care. With him, it was not a question. It was a conclusion presented for her review. The months of duplicity, the carefully constructed second life, the secret self she had nurtured under the Andalusian sun, all of it crystallized in that moment into a single, irrefutable, damning fact. The silence that followed was her confession, more eloquent than any words. When she finally found her voice, it was a shattered thing, barely audible. "His name is Javier," she whispered, and the name, a sacred syllable in the private liturgy of her heart, felt profane in this clean, ordered room. "I am in love with him." David did not erupt. He did not shout or throw the glass or sweep the meal from the table. He simply absorbed the words. She watched as the color drained from his face, leaving it a pale, waxy mask. He looked at her not with anger, but with the horrified clinical comprehension of a man who has just discovered a necrotic, metastasizing disease in a patient he had, moments before, pronounced in perfect health. The betrayal was not just of their vows, it was of his entire epistemology, his belief in evidence, in observable truth. He had missed the symptoms. For how long? The question was flat, devoid of inflection, a request for data. Since the beginning, she breathed, almost from the very beginning. He nodded once, a sharp mechanical gesture, as if filing the datum. And this person you are with him, this is the uncensored manuscript, is it? The first draft of Maya? The version with the furious margins, the crossed-out passages, the bleeding ink? The cruelty of his metaphor, wielded with such surgical precision, was more devastating than any physical blow. It laid her utterly, nakedly bare, exposing the very core of the secret life she had cherished. It reduced the profound, terrifying awakening of her soul to a literary cliché. A sob broke from her, harsh and ugly. "I don't know," she wept, the tears coming in a hot, shameful flood. "David, I am so desperately, unforgivably sorry." "But you are," he interrupted, his voice finally cracking, a fissure appearing in his monumental control. The raw pain that seeped out made her physically recoil. "You are sorry, but you still chose it. You still lived it. You took a shared text, a life we authored together line by careful line over 8 years, and you introduced a plagiarized chapter. You interpolated a foreign narrative. You made every word that came before it suspect, every memory a potential forgery." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping the floor like a scream. His body was rigid, vibrating with a tension that threatened to shatter him. "I want you to leave. Tonight. Now. I cannot. I cannot look at you in this space. You have contaminated it. You have contaminated everything." The packing was a surreal, out-of-body ordeal. She moved through their beautiful apartment, a ghost haunting the museum of her former life, pulling clothes and books and toiletries with numb, clumsy hands. David did not watch. He stood in the living room, his back to her, staring out at the city lights as if searching for a pattern in the chaos, his silhouette a monument to devastation. The sound of her suitcase wheels on the polished floor was the only sound in the tomb-like quiet. She went to a generic, mid-tier hotel near Paddington Station, a place chosen for its utter anonymity. The constant rumble of trains beneath the city felt like the grinding of tectonic plates, a fitting soundtrack for the collapse of her world. Sitting on the edge of the stiff synthetic bedspread, she texted Javier. The message was simple, a stark telegram of ruin. "He knows everything. It is over." His reply came not immediately, but with the dawn in Spain, a lifetime later. "La casa es tuya." The house is yours. For 3 weeks she tried to make it so. She fled back to the finca, to the stark beauty that had unmade her. But she was a different person now, a walking ruin, and the majestic, demanding silence of the place offered no shelter from the internal hurricane of consequences. She moved through the familiar rituals, the morning light in the scriptorium, the taste of the oil, the scent of the sage like a sleepwalker. She missed with a shocking physical ache that felt like phantom limb pain, the deep, quiet comforts of her London life, the predictable warmth, the intellectual camaraderie of David's mind, the effortless, taken-for-granted safety. Javier's world, which had felt like the ultimate freedom, now felt like another form of exile, a beautiful, unforgiving isolation. He watched her struggle, his dark eyes filled with a sad, knowing patience. The final quiet unraveling came on a day of perfect, crystalline autumn light. She was in the courtyard, mechanically attempting to sketch a pomegranate tree, her hands shaking. Her phone, a hated tether to the wreckage, buzzed incessantly with emails from her solicitor, questions about asset division, the cold, legal language of dissolution. Javier approached, holding 2 small glasses of the local, fiery orujo. "You are trying to irrigate a desert with salt water," he said, his voice calm. He handed her a glass. "I don't know what else to do," she whispered, the tears not coming anymore, just a dry, hollow exhaustion. "I am not a sanctuary, Maya," he said, his gaze steady on the distant mountains. I am the desert itself. I thought you craved its purity, its absolute honesty. But you are trying to build an oasis here with materials from a different world. It will not hold. The sand will claim it. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not rejection, but a profound, heartbreaking acceptance. You love the idea of this life, of my life, but you do not love the life itself. The winter here is long and hard. The silence is not romantic. It is a fact, and it can drive you mad. The work is ceaseless. This is not a restoration project for your soul. It is a life, and it is mine. You must find your own. The realization was a quiet, profound parting, more painful in its clarity than any dramatic fight. She had mistaken the electrifying, transformative process of being deciphered, of being seen in her raw, unedited form, for a sustainable destination. He had been the brilliant, relentless key that had unlocked the sealed scriptorium of her soul. But he was not, and could never be, the dwelling for the complicated, wounded, modern woman who stumbled out into the light. She loved him with a ferocity that would likely haunt her forever. But she was not of his earth, his silence, his centuries' deep patience. She was a creature of cities and subtitles, and her ruin was of a different, more tangled kind. She left La Cuesta del Silencio as the first true autumn rains began, a cold gray drizzle that darkened the ochre stone to the color of dried blood, and released the scent of wet sage and petrichor. The finished translation of the Velasco manuscripts, a masterpiece of empathetic scholarship that would later be published to quiet, rapturous acclaim in specialized circles, remained on the oak table. She did not take a copy. She did not say goodbye. She simply walked out of the great door one morning, her single suitcase lighter than when she had arrived, and did not look back. She did not return to London. She used part of the project fee to rent a small, bright flat in Barcelona, a city that was foreign yet navigable, layered with history but vibrantly, noisily alive. She took on commercial translation work to pay the bill's corporate reports, technical manuals, the bland, bloodless texts that were the antithesis of de la Cruz's tortured poetry. The transcendent, soul-rewiring work with Javier had forever ruined her for the mundane, but it had also seared into her the devastating, non-negotiable price of the sublime. She would never again confuse accuracy with truth. Nearly a year to the day after her world fractured, a parcel with a Spanish postmark arrived. It was a flat, square package wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with coarse twine. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried lavender and rosemary, was not a book, but a heavy handmade tile of paper. It had been formed from the pulp of fig and mulberry, embedded with delicate fossil-like fragments of olive leaves and wild thyme. In the center, in that familiar, stark, angular hand, was inscribed the phrase that had begun it all, El fuego oscuro del alma. And beneath it, Javier had written, Para la escriba que se convirtió en el margen. Hardehaka, for the scribe who became the margin. She placed the tile on the raw pine shelf in her minimally furnished living room, where the Mediterranean light could catch the textures of leaf and pulp. It held nothing. It asked for nothing. It simply was a beautiful, silent testament to a transformation that was real, even if the life that inspired it could not be lived. She heard through the faint, frayed threads of old acquaintances that David had taken a prestigious endowed chair at a medical institute in Zurich. She hoped with a pain that had matured from a sharp, specific agony into a permanent, low-grade atmosphere of her being, like the change pressure before a storm that never quite breaks, that he had found a way to rebuild his trust in observable facts, that he was happy. One evening, as the last of the sun gilded the rooftops of the Gracia district, the silence in her flat was different. It was not the sterile hush of her old office, nor the profound weighted silence of the finca. It was her own silence, empty but charged with a potential that was terrifying in its openness. She sat at a simple desk by the window, a blank, high-quality notebook open before her. For the first time in her professional life, she did not reach for a dictionary nor a source text. She picked up her favorite fountain pen, the one she had used to annotate the Venetian letters and de la Cruz's mad hymns alike. She watched the skies shift from gold to violet, Then with a hand that was steady, she brought the nib to the pristine waiting page. She did not translate. She did not interpret. She did not seek an equivalent in any language but her own. She wrote a single, simple, declarative sentence. It was about the quality of the fading light on the pale wall opposite her, the way it turned the white paint the color of a ripe apricot. It was not poetic. It was not erudite. It was not clever. It was merely exactly and finally true. It was her own original text, beginning, hesitantly and without a map, to inscribe itself. The story of the affair, of the great betrayal and the greater awakening, was over. The faithful translation of a borrowed life was complete. All that remained was the vast, empty, and terrifyingly free blank page, and the uncertain, undeniable authority of her own hand, moving across it, one word at a time, into the unwritten future.